At 3:14 in the morning, in a rented house outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, I was standing in my own kitchen with the lights off, gripping the edge of the counter, waiting for my heart rate to come back down from somewhere it had no business being at that hour. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling in a way that made my whole body tense before my mind had caught up to explain why. That was a Tuesday. It was also more or less every night for the better part of 40 years, a routine so old and so worn into me that I'd stopped even describing it to people as insomnia, the way you stop describing your own accent once you've lived somewhere long enough. I want to tell you what it's like now, on the other side of the world, in a wooden hut on a mountainside in northern Thailand, where 3 nights ago I slept for 6 straight hours without once opening my eyes. 6 hours. I hadn't done that since 1971. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe, because I try to tell the stories other people skip past. And I don't think anybody talks enough about what happens to a man's nights, not just his finances or his health care, when he finally finds the right place to land. My name's Trevor. I did 2 tours in Vietnam, 1969 to 1971, infantry. And I'm not going to walk you through the specifics of what I saw over there, because that's not really what this story is about, and some of it isn't mine to hand out to strangers on the internet anyway. What I will tell you is that I came home a different man than I left as, and the difference showed up first, before anything else, in my sleep. I stopped being able to just lie down and drift off the way I had my whole life before that. My body wouldn't let me. Every small sound, a car door, a branch against the window, my wife rolling over in bed, and I was awake, fully awake, heart going, sometimes back in a place I won't describe, sometimes just lying there rigid until first light. I didn't have a name for it for years. Nobody did, not really, not in any way that helped. They called it nerves, or adjustment, or just Trevor being Trevor now. It wasn't until decades later, sitting across from a VA psychologist in my 60s, a patient younger woman who let me talk for 20 minutes before she said much of anything at all, that somebody finally said the words post-traumatic stress disorder to me and connected it directly to what my nights had looked like since I was 22 years old. I remember sitting in that office feeling something close to relief and something close to grief arrive at exactly the same moment. Relief that there was finally a name for it. Grief for every year I'd spent treating it as a personal failing instead of what it actually was. I want to give you a sense of the scale of this, because I didn't understand it myself until I started looking into it for this very video. Something like 90 to 100% of Vietnam-era veterans with PTSD report significant insomnia, and more than half report frequent nightmares on top of it, and later research on the newer generation, the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, found insomnia rates in the same brutal neighborhood. Over 90% among those with PTSD. I am, in other words, not an outlier. I am closer to the rule than the exception, and that in itself was strange to learn at 76 years old, that my particular 3 a.m. had been shared almost identically across generations by hundreds of thousands of other men who'd worn the same uniform decades apart, fighting different wars against the exact same nights. It cost me things over the years that I can only fully add up looking backward. I worked 30 years as a machinist in Fayetteville. Decent, steady work. But I turned down 2 promotions that would have meant night shifts, because the idea of being awake and alert in a factory at 3 a.m., instead of home gripping my own counter, felt, somehow, less frightening than the alternative, even though it made no logical sense. I fell asleep at my own son Mark's Little League championship. Not from boredom, but from pure accumulated exhaustion. 3 days after a stretch of nights so bad I'd stopped bothering to lie down at all. And I still remember the specific look on his face afterward when he asked me, gently, for an 8-year-old, whether I'd seen his home run. I tried everything this country had to offer over 4 decades. Sleeping pills that worked for a while and then stopped working, and then created their own problems entirely, leaving me groggy through whole mornings I couldn't afford to lose. A Prazosin prescription that helped with the nightmares some years and did nothing other years. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is genuinely good science, and I'd tell anybody to try it. And it helped me manage the edges of the problem without ever touching the center of it. I drank for a stretch in my 30s and 40s, the way a lot of guys from my unit did. And I want to be honest that it never once actually helped me sleep. It just helped me stop caring that I couldn't, which isn't the same thing and cost me things I still think about. My first marriage ended partly over it. My ex-wife Donna telling me, not unkindly, in the kitchen of a house we'd owned for 14 years, that she couldn't spend 1 more decade married to a man who flinched at the coffee maker. She wasn't angry when she said it. That was almost the hardest part, how calm and tired she sounded, like a woman who'd simply run out of the specific kind of patience that doesn't refill itself. I don't blame her for that. I flinched at the coffee maker too, and had for so long that I'd stopped noticing I was doing it until she pointed it out one last time on her way out the door with 2 suitcases. My son Mark used to ask me, when he was young, why Dad slept with the lights on and the door cracked, and 1 boot always by the bed. I never had a good answer for a kid. I have a slightly better one now, but it took me most of my life to build it. Comment down below if you've dealt with sleep problems, from your own service or anywhere else in your life, that nobody around you seemed to fully understand, because I think this is one of the most underdiscussed parts of what combat does to a person, and I'd like to know how differently people have handled it. The path here started honestly with a fellow veteran named Curtis, a guy from my VA support group who'd done a tour in Afghanistan decades after my war, and had his own version of the same 3 a.m. We'd sat next to each other in that circle of folding chairs almost every Thursday for 2 years, without saying much beyond the basics, the way men in those groups often do. Respectful of each other's silence more than curious about each other's stories. Curtis had spent 2 months in Thailand the year before, mostly on a whim after a divorce, and he came back to group talking about it in a way that stuck with me, not the beaches or the food, but specifically about sleep. He said something like, "Trevor, I don't know what it is, the heat, the quiet. Something about the way people move slower there. But I slept better in a bug-bitten hut in the mountains than I had in my own bed in 10 years. I filed that away the way you file away a lot of things other veterans say in group, half believing it, half wanting it to be true for myself without daring to hope too hard." because I'd chased that particular hope down 100 dead ends before and I was tired, in every sense of the word, of being disappointed by it. What actually made me look into it seriously was learning, almost by accident, that my VA disability compensation doesn't stop just because you leave the country. I'd assumed, the way a lot of guys assume, that moving overseas meant giving up what I'd earned, and it took a conversation with a VISO representative to correct that assumption entirely. VA disability compensation is portable, full stop, paid the same whether you're in Fayetteville or Chiang Mai. Direct deposited through an international system, tax-free the same as it's always been. What isn't automatically portable is the health care itself. But the VA runs something called the Foreign Medical Program, specifically for veterans overseas, which covers treatment tied to your service-connected conditions, including the mental health side. Even when you're thousands of miles from the nearest VA hospital, I still do my regular therapy sessions through VA telehealth, video calls at a reasonable hour Thailand side even with the time difference. And for everything else, routine checkups, the odd stomach bug, a knee that's been complaining since basic training. I carry a private international health plan here that runs me under $100 a month, less than what I used to pay just for the copay on a single specialist visit back home. I sat with that VISO for almost 2 hours, going through what I'd lose and what I wouldn't, and by the end of it I understood that the only thing actually keeping me in North Carolina was my own assumption, not any rule written down anywhere. I landed in Chiang Mai 14 months ago with a plan that was really more of a hope than a plan, which was simply to see if Curtis had been telling the truth. I rented a small apartment near the old city for about $250 a month, a plain studio with a ceiling fan and a view of a neighbor's mango tree. And for the first several weeks, nothing changed. I still woke at 3, still stood in unfamiliar dark kitchens gripping unfamiliar counters, just with different street sounds outside the window instead of the ones I'd memorized back home. A stray dog instead of a passing car. A night market packing up instead of a neighbor's television. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important. This wasn't a magic switch that flipped the day I got off the plane. Thailand didn't cure 40 years of wiring in a person's nervous system overnight, and anybody who tells you it did is selling you something. I nearly booked a flight home in my 3rd week, genuinely doubting the whole decision, before Curtis, over a phone call at an hour that was polite in Thailand and rude in North Carolina, talked me into giving it past the first month. What actually started to shift things was a forest monastery about 4 hours north of Chiang Mai, near a town called Pai, called Wat Pa Tam Wa. Curtis had mentioned it in passing, almost as an afterthought, and I went mostly out of stubbornness, telling myself I'd give it 3 days and prove to myself it wouldn't work. It's a real working Buddhist monastery, not a resort dressed up as one, run entirely on donations, where anybody of any background or belief is welcome to stay and take part in the daily meditation schedule. The van ride up from Chiang Mai took the better part of 5 hours. Switchbacks through green hills that got steeper and quieter the further we went, until the driver finally pointed at a dirt track off the highway and told me that was it. Mornings start at 5, before the heat sets in, with sitting meditation in an open-sided hall, looking out at limestone mountains still wrapped in fog, a single gong sounding somewhere to mark the start. No alarm clock, no bugle, nothing that made my chest tighten the way sudden sounds used to. There's walking meditation, which I'd never once tried in my life, just slow, deliberate steps back and forth along a marked path, your whole attention on the sensation of your own foot touching ground. Nothing else, no vigilance required, no perimeter to watch. There's a laying meditation practice too, which sounds almost absurd to describe. Lying flat on a thin mat with a wooden pillow and simply noticing your own breath. And I remember the monk explaining it to a small group of us on my second day, saying, in careful English, the mind that watches the breath cannot also watch the door. I didn't understand what he meant until the third night, when I realized I'd fallen asleep during the practice itself, an actual accidental nap, which had not happened to me in a room with an open door in longer than I could accurately remember. I stayed at that monastery 11 days instead of 3. I slept on a thin mat on a wooden floor with a mosquito net and a hard pillow, conditions that would have sounded like a punishment to me a year earlier. And I slept better on that floor than I had in memory foam beds worth more than my first car. I don't fully understand the mechanism of it, and I want to be careful here. Because I'm not a doctor and I'm not telling you this replaces actual treatment, it didn't replace mine. I still see a therapist by video call through the VA's telehealth program every other week. But something about the structure of that place, the complete absence of anything to be vigilant about, the heat that makes your body settle instead of brace, the total predictability of every single hour of the day, gave my nervous system something it apparently had been asking for since 1971, and never once received. Since coming back to Chiang Mai proper, I've built a version of that structure into ordinary life, the same way you'd rebuild a house after a storm using whatever lumber actually held up. I go back to Wat Pa Tam Wa for about a week, every couple of months, and in between I keep mornings simple and physical, walking the moat before the heat arrives, sitting for 20 minutes on my own small balcony the way the monks taught me. Nothing complicated, just the breath, just the ground under my feet. I've found there's a small community of veterans in this part of Thailand, a mix of my own generation and much younger men from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we meet most weeks at a coffee shop near the university. An unofficial thing nobody organized on purpose. It just accumulated the way these things do. One guy telling another guy at the market, that guy showing up the following Tuesday. A younger vet named Danny, maybe 40 years my junior, sat across from me one morning and said, almost embarrassed to admit it, that he'd started sleeping through the night for the first time since Fallujah, and hearing a man 4 decades younger describe my exact same miracle, in almost my exact same words, did something to me I still haven't fully worked out how to talk about. We don't do formal group therapy at that table, nothing clinical about it. Mostly just old men and young men trading the specific unglamorous logistics of getting better. Which pharmacy in town stocks what? Which monk at the temple speaks the best English? Whose nightmares came back last month, and what helped bring them back down? It's the closest thing to my old VA support circle I've found on this side of the planet. Except every single person at that table is also somehow sleeping better than they used to. which gives the conversation a different weight than the folding chairs back home ever had. My son Mark came to visit 5 months ago, skeptical the way sons get about fathers who make big changes late in life. Arriving with the specific wariness of a man who'd spent his whole childhood learning to read my bad nights off my face at breakfast, the way other kids read weather. I watched him watch me over those 2 weeks. Watched him notice that I wasn't checking the door lock 4 times before bed anymore, that I sat with my back to a restaurant window without needing to switch seats. Small things he probably didn't even know he'd cataloged about me his whole childhood, until their absence became visible to him one dinner at a time. Halfway through the trip he asked me, almost testing the words out loud for the first time, whether I remembered the year I'd barely spoken to him. And I told him honestly that I remembered it as a blur of exhaustion I'd never fully explained to him at the time, and probably owed him that explanation more than I'd ever given it. On his last night, sitting on my little balcony with 2 beers we mostly didn't drink, he said, "Dad, I don't think I've ever actually seen you rest. Not once. Not my whole life." I didn't have a good answer for him in the moment. I've had a little more time to think about one since. I still have hard nights here, and I want to say that clearly so nobody watching this thinks I'm selling a fairy tale. Maybe once every couple of weeks the old wiring still fires. Some sound or smell or a dream I don't choose. And I'm back gripping a counter in the dark, same as always. My heart doing the same old math it's done since I was 22. My body forgetting for a minute that the war it's bracing for ended more than half a century ago. But it went from every single night for 40 years to occasionally, and I don't think most people who haven't lived inside that particular prison understand what a difference of scale that actually is. It's the difference between a life organized entirely around bracing for the next bad night, planning tomorrow's schedule around how wrecked you already know you'll be, and a life where the bad nights are the exception you can recover from instead of the whole architecture you live inside, the weather instead of the climate. 3 nights ago, the night I mentioned at the start of this, I woke up at what turned out to be almost 5 in the morning, which for me is close to a miracle in itself, and instead of gripping anything, I just lay there for a minute in the gray early light coming through the shutters, listening to a rooster 2 streets over and a motorbike somewhere, and the particular hum of a Chiang Mai morning getting started. And I noticed, almost like discovering an old friend's face in a crowd, that my heart rate was just ordinary, not racing, not braced, just a man in his 70s, lying in a bed on the other side of the planet, from where his war happened, breathing normally in the morning for what felt, after 40 years, like maybe the first real time. I thought about Donna for a second, the way I sometimes do in that particular kind of quiet, and I thought that if she could see me now, not fixed, not cured, just quieter inside my own skin than I ever managed to be across 14 years of marriage to her, she might finally believe that the flinching wasn't ever really about the coffee maker at all. I got up, made my own coffee without flinching at a single sound in the kitchen, no car door, no branch on glass, and sat on the balcony to watch the sun come up over the mountains, which is not a small thing for a man who spent 4 decades treating sunrise as just another hour he'd failed to sleep through instead of a hopeful ordinary event. I'm Trevor. Thank you for listening to Retirement Without Borders.